to Middle East Breakdown. I'm Hayvi Bouzo, joined by Dan Feferman. We're the co-founders and co-editors of Middle East 24. Today, we're going to be unpacking a significant and underreported shift in the Gulf, growing tensions between Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, two countries long seen as close strategic allies and partners. Our guest today is Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour, an Egyptian-American writer and analyst, and the author of the Abrahamic Metacritic. Hussein recently wrote a sharp and timely piece examining what these tensions really signaled beneath the surface. It's called The Saudi Pivot. From Saudi Arabia pulling major media platforms out of the UAE hubs like Dubai and relocating them to Riyadh, to diverging positions on South Yemen, Somaliland, Sudan, and even the Palestinian issue. This is not just diplomatic friction, it's a reassertion of power, influence, and regional leadership. We'll also look at where Qatar actually fits into this realignment and how conflicts in South Yemen, Sudan, and the Horn of Africa have become arenas for Gulf competition. Let's break it down. And before we do, I want to remind our audience, follow us on Instagram, X, Facebook, YouTube, and of course, subscribe to our channels on Spotify, iTunes for your favorite podcasts. Middle East Breakdown on ME24. Yours truly, Hayvi Bouzo, joined by Dan Feferman, my co-founder, co-editor. Give us the best rating. We are actually going to be always telling you and unpacking for you the untold stories about the developments in the Middle East, North Africa region that you do not get on traditional media and social media. Let's start. Thank you so much for joining us today, Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour. It's obviously a past due opportunity for us to be together in a podcast. I've been looking forward to having you on for a while, and then Dan was like, he read the article that you just wrote at the Saudi Pivot, and he was like, read this. We definitely have to have Hussein on our podcast, Middle East Breakdown. So I'm so happy to have you on with us today.
Thank you for having me. So wonderful to have you with us, Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour. Like Hayvi, I've been following your work for a long time, and we've met here and there a couple times over the years. But if you're not following Hussein's excellent Substack, the Abrahamic Metacritic, we encourage you to do so. Subscribe. I'm actually going to become a subscriber of yours today. Excellent kind of giving the broader frameworks of trying to understand big developments in the region. And I personally connect to that. I find those incredibly useful. And it's your piece, your new piece, the Saudi Pivot, that really intrigued me and that I wanted to try to unpack and understand here, and bring you on the show. Something big is happening in the region. And I want to take the audience back to 2020 and what we have. So when the Abraham Accords were formulating, and on a personal level, I was involved in that a lot. I know Hayvi was as well. I was trying to figure out, what does this mean for the region? And the framework that I had reached is that enough powers in the Middle East, led by the UAE, which I, at the time at least, and I'm rethinking my position, viewed as this sort of R&D lab, kind of the forward-thinking actor of the region. And the changes, the successful changes that were coming out of the UAE were the ones that were going to impact the Middle East, broadly speaking. And what I began to notice is that enough countries in the region were understanding that the Israeli-Arab conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, was only holding the region back. I had additional elements of the analysis that they understood that the Palestinians themselves had done nothing, if very little, to help their own cause, rejecting compromise offer after compromise offer, and that Israel was just moving ahead. And so the Abraham Accords kind of brought together this entire framework of regional integration, of the need to defeat Islamism for their own sake and not for anyone else's, and that, of course, economic prosperity and political stability, that which go hand in hand, were the most important elements of what was happening in the region. That's how I understood it. And then I saw the October 7th attack as a sort of revolt against that. And I called it a revolt of the destroyers. For the last 2 years, I'd been watching this dynamic play out in the region. And you see the Saudis actually insisting that the Abraham Accords are still on the table. And then it looked like they were pushing the Syrians to get involved in it. The Emiratis and the Bahrainis and the Moroccans stood together. And it looked like that framework had won. And then a couple months ago, kind of with the trigger being Yemen and the UAE's backing of South Yemen, you saw a split, a very, very curious split in this dynamic. And now, we here at ME24, Hayvi and I and Abdulaziz and others have been trying to make sense of it. What does it mean? What's going on here? And along comes your piece that I think does a very nice job of trying to unpack this. Of course, for the audience, if you're interested in this, check out last week's episode that we did with Rob Sandloff, where we also discuss in depth these changes. And so we wanted to dive into this with you, Hussein, and kind of maybe use this as a framework to talk about the big shifts that are happening in the region.
The framework that you just outlined, it's very compelling. A lot of people, I also viewed things largely this way with the Abrahamic Accords, and I think a lot of people also do. I think a lot of our audience actually understands exactly what we're talking about. It's very disorienting politically for a lot of people to see basically the reality is not matching at all that vision. I will actually take us back in order to understand the conditions that actually gave birth to that vision to begin with, and that will make us perhaps see why then we're now in a different place, since a lot of these conditions have transformed. So the Middle East, basically in the past 15 or 16 years, have been structured by the consequences of the events of the Arab Spring. All of these consequences were the main driver of a lot of the events. So basically, you had the Arab Spring starting in late 2010, 2011 spreading into Egypt, Syria, so on, and Sudan, so on and so forth. Rise of Islamism and primarily the Muslim Brotherhood to take over power in Muslim countries, civil war in Syria. Egypt, of course, was the main issue in which the largest Arab country basically being taken over by the Muslim Brotherhood, and ultimately a series of state collapse, civil wars, so on and so forth. This obviously was a major breakdown moment of kind of the post-Arab nationalism equilibrium that Arab countries had reached for the 50 years before. A lot of the Arab republics collapsed, and then you had basically the group of Arab monarchies that survived all of this mayhem, and then they had to deal with it, or they had to check it, trying to stabilize the region, and most importantly, trying to check or prevent those who are trying to exploit it. Of course, the main exploiter, all of the chaos of the Arab Spring, following the Arab Spring, was primarily Iran, that managed then to extend its already existing infrastructure of proxies and regional powers to create what became kind of the Shia, what people call the Shia crescent, or the axis of resistance, in which you had Iran being able to project its power from its own hinterland all the way through Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and to the Mediterranean on the borders of Israel. It was something unprecedented.
And in Yemen also, of course.
And of course, and the other side in Yemen. So you have here, they are projecting power right into basically Haifa and Tel Aviv. At the same time, they are projecting power into Riyadh and a lot of the Gulf country. It's not an exaggeration to say that no regional power in the Middle East had able to project power this far in this capacity since the Ottoman Empire. So you had this massive rise of this massive threat of the Iranians. And at the same time, you had massive changes in American foreign policy. Now, America has been deeply involved in the Middle East since the Iraq War, deeply present. But this corresponded with the events of the Arab Spring, corresponded, of course, with the rise of the first Obama administration, which had massive transformations of U.S. visions and strategies of foreign policy in the Middle East towards accommodation of Islamist movements, and most crucially and most devastatingly, accommodation of Iran itself.
I think we can't downplay how significant this was. And at the time, I was actually a policy advisor in the Israeli military on these issues, and we worked with the new Obama team. And I remember the sheer, maybe naivete, but the clear change in worldview that they brought in. And you saw this shift. We saw this shift in our conversations with U.S. officials very clearly playing out.
Exactly. And they had a vision that basically moved away American alliance, or aspired to. I mean, you see it in the actual writings of figures like Robert Malley, that basically the future of U.S. alliance in the region is Islamic popular movements, because they are the ones who have the street. They are likely the ones to have power. That included reaching an accommodation with Iran that happened through the CPOA, to which Israel and the Arab countries heavily objected. All of this big context of instability, state collapse, Iranian threats, did multiple things. First of all, it brought these Gulf countries closer together. And that created primarily the Arab Gulf axis of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. That basically became the dominant Arab power in the last decade, and was seen by a lot of people that this is the axis of stability in the region, is countering Iran. This axis tried to do multiple things. It tried to check Qatari a patronage of Islamist movements. Everybody remember the blockade that they had on Qatar. They basically had the Saudis actually literally threatened Qatar with invasion. And by the way, a lot of also Qatari strategies comes from that time. So building this empire of influence in the U.S., it actually, a lot of it have to do with that context as well, in order to try to escape this Arab resistance from the Arab axis of moderation. And also started to bring the Arabs and the Israelis together in an unofficial capacity, intelligence sharing and so on too. And ultimately, this process culminated in the Abrahamic Accords between UAE and Israel. Of course, Bahrain, Morocco joined. Saudi Arabia had a tacit acceptance that was basically formalized in opening its airspace for the aircrafts that are making the trips between UAE. That saves 2 hours, by the way. That's a lot.
Believe me, I've done that flight many times. What my Gulf colleagues and friends have stated, that's the Gulf countries don't make such massive moves without Saudi approval. And so how do you view, within that context of everything that was changing, was the Abraham Accords fundamental shift, or was it a reflection of a certain window at a certain time that was utilized? Because you mentioned the Qatari kind of rivalry with the UAE slightly at one point, and I remember that very clearly. So has that fundamental underpinning changed?
A lot of this has changed, but basically these were the conditions in which the Abraham Accords were possible. I also don't want to exaggerate the whole issue of Saudi approval. Of course, you can't have Saudi resistance to such a big move, but ultimately these states insist on independent foreign policy, even when they are working together. And we saw eventually how that played out in Yemen. But yes, these were conditions in which the Abraham Accords happened. The last thing that I have to outline before we move on from this setting up this stage is basically also the uncertainty about U.S. foreign policy. So you had this massive transformation that happened with the Obama vision that we just discussed. Then it happened again with the Trump administration. All of a sudden, the Obama administration's out, and then you have the Trump administration, and then happened again with the Biden administration. So clearly, the certain...
Yeah. I'm sorry, just to jump in there. I've been saying this also for a while now, in that I had two, with Obama, it was a pushback against American involvement in this. I think you described it very nicely. U.S. recalibrating who are essentially the good guys and bad guys in the region. Right, like reaching out to Islamists, reaching out to Iran, and then all of a sudden you have Trump, who also doesn't want to get involved. I love saying this to American audiences. I say very different reasons. You had U.S. not wanting to get involved in the Middle East in a bipartisan fashion, right?
Right, and they were withdrawing. Not withdrawing. America is still heavily involved, but America is no longer. And that happened gradually, but I think now it's very clear that the United States is not going to underwrite regional order. That is, we're not going to pay the cost. We're going to have relations with everyone. We're going to do the transactions that we need to do, but we're not going to underwrite the overall regional structure. But anyways, during that period, you had two main forces. Now, in all these conditions that I outlined, you had two main forces that created the structure of regional relations that created the Abraham Accords. And those two forces was this American presence that's still there, but it's uncertain. So that American management was still there. You're still dealing with it, and the Iranian axis of resistance that is responding to this adversarial force. And these two forces together structured the region in the way that it created the UAE-Saudi Arabia alignment, produced the Abraham Accords, made Qatar into a pariah, and so on and so forth. Now, once you remove those two conditions, that is, once the axis of resistance in effect is no longer existence, and once it's very clear that the United States only going to be involved in a certain way, those two structuring forces then are not there. And that means that the region, there will be kind of a scramble in which then the region has to find a new structure in which everybody is going to try to gain leverage on everybody else. This was...
Yeah. What's interesting about this is that Saudi Arabia, has been consistently, though, against the Islamic Republic of Iran, against that regime. And now we're at the pivoting point where this regime is actually on the verge of something major happening, possibly the collapse of the regime or being toppled internally. Something big is basically emerging right now in Iran. And we see that in this historic moment, we are seeing a change in the Saudi position on the toppling of the Islamic Republic of Iran, even though we've known that Saudi Arabia has been actually at war, specifically with the Houthis in Yemen. And this is just one aspect of that. But you also mentioned in your article that this shift in Iran and what just happened in Venezuela might also make Saudi Arabia more nervous about its positioning in terms of the oil industry, what's going to happen to OPEC. Plus, like, can you go into this aspect? Because we'll get to the relationships with the UAE right after, but let's talk about that part.
No, this is a great point. I started speculating that this is going to be the case back actually in June, in the summer. So we wrote an article. I actually encourage everyone to go check it out. Back in June, it was published in Mosaic magazine. It's on their website. Just 5 days after the Israeli operations, or a few days after the Israeli operations started in Iran, Operation Rising Line. In fact, then, and everybody was speculating, oh, that's it. Iran's going to be defeated. It's going to be a regime change. The Saudis will normalize peace and love and so on and so forth.
Yes, that's the hope.
That was the hope of a lot of people. So I actually had a very counterintuitive vision at that moment. And that was the article saying, actually, the opposite will happen. If now that Iran humbled, first of all, the Saudis will have no incentive to normalize. Not just that they will not have an incentive to normalize. If you think about it, taking out Iran as a competitor transforms the structure that made Israel into the partner into a structure that makes Israel into a competitor. That is, once Israel is no longer a threat in which I need the Israelis to check. So now, and that threat is gone. So basically now I have this big Israeli power that no one else...
Iran is no longer a threat, do you mean?
Yes, once Iran is no longer a threat, that means I have this very strong Israel no one else can check. That could be
about Turkey. I mean, the issue here, what's really baffling to me is that Turkey is a threat, and it's been a threat, and it's been supporting the
rival. It's a rival, but it's not a threat. It's a major rival.
So how did the Muslim Brotherhood supporting element, which has always been, I believe, is a threat to Saudi Arabia at the kingdom, right?
Right.
Why did that become a non-issue all of a sudden?
I'll finish the oil point and then I get to.
Yes.
So once Iran is humbled, now you have to think like the Saudis. So assume that you're Saudi Arabia. Okay, so now this massive threat that was on my borders is no more. What do I want? Do I want a secular liberal Iran that then becomes a friend of the West, a friend of Israel, competes with me over Western investments, and then he joins the international oil market, dumps a lot of its reserves, takes down the oil prices, depresses the oil prices, and then I have less revenue for all my projects. Does that make sense? Okay, what is the ideal for me as a Saudis? Actually, the ideal for me is an Iran that is defeated but not destroyed. It's the humiliated Islamic Republic that remains an international pariah. They can't sell oil legally to anybody in the Western Hemisphere, and they can't threaten me at the same time. At the same time, perhaps I can work with them to gain influence in the regions that they use to control. And then, okay, what am I going to do with Israel? Well, I don't need to normalize anymore, but now that transforms them into a competitor. So what do? I ask them for a Palestinian state, knowing that since that's not a possibility, that will make them remain a pariah, gives me the moral and political upper hand regionally and internationally. And I wrote that back in June, and that's exactly what happened. That is, the Saudis all of a sudden made it their objective to have a Palestinian state. Everybody knows what happened in the last year. Not just this, they are the main solicitor of all of the international recognitions of a Palestinian state that happened after the war. So Canada, France, all of these recognitions of Palestinians were actually the movers of this. So you can make sure that Iran's not going to depress the oil prices, which, by the way, became even a bigger imperative as the changes happened in Venezuela. After the U.S. operation in Venezuela, Venezuela has the largest oil reserve in the world. That means you likely, if Venezuela gets rehabilitated into the international system, you're also going to get this input of oil that will depress prices. So basically Israel's success that in that summer would transform the structure of regional relations that made the Saudis see things differently. They see the Iranians differently, they see the Israeli differently, and they see the Emiratis differently. And then one of the tools that they could play, and that brings you to your point about the Muslim Brotherhood, basically rhetoric. They have a lot of symbolic power. We all know that Middle East politics, Arab politics specifically, run on a lot of symbolic politics: Palestine, Islam, Arabism, Arab honor, so on and so forth. Basically, they decided you probably have a large comparative advantage in the symbolic politics game, even though that they are completely crushing Islamism domestically. There's no reason that you shouldn't instrumentalize it regionally.
The shift in media, we know that media has this power. And traditionally, Saudi media outlets were all in the UAE. Now they have been moving to Riyadh, which is another point of friction between both countries, right? When we're talking about Saudi Arabia shifting its position on these issues, we know that there are major TV networks and news networks that are Saudi-owned. Does that mean we're going to be seeing also a shift? Because we saw a bit of that too on the narrative level, because we've already been dealing with Al Jazeera and all of the hate and the promotion of terrorism and extremism in the Middle East, North Africa, and in the West, unfortunately, which has been changing minds and hearts. Does that also reflect Saudi media, or is it gonna be only in terms of politics, but not in the rhetoric, since they are fighting Islamism internally still?
No, it's already deeply reflected. Zionism, it's the massive, I think the shock for a lot of people who've been following is just the amount of anti-Zionist just drivel that suddenly exploded in Saudi-owned media and Saudi religious sermons these last few weeks, something that you would not have seen at all, just a few months ago. No, it's already kind of changed their media. Media and narrative games are now, they are a central pillar of politics today, everywhere, including the United States, as we see. The social media, a narrative control, so on and so forth. On their part as well, and this is kind of almost fun and surreal to watch in real time. As this realignment happened, so as the strikes happened on the Emirati forces in Yemen, and basically Saudi Arabia made this huge pivot, Qataris suddenly activated this huge empire. The Qataris run a massive empire, narrative control. I mean, not just Al Jazeera in the Middle East. By the way, it's not just Al Jazeera. They own like 54 major networks in the Middle East.
We've been talking about this for a long time. Their massive empire of different kinds of media that have different audiences, their social media empire that they run. I mean, it's truly astonishing.
It's not just Islamists. People think it's only Muslim. No, it's not. The leftists, I mean, they own the entire narrative of the left.
And now the right. And now they're buying the right.
And now on the right, yeah. Now they are investing with America first. It's narrative control empire. They started really early. It really escalated after the blockade from the UAE and Saudi Arabia into the Western Hemisphere. Massive investments in universities. They control the rhetoric in Middle East departments in most of our prestigious schools. Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C., that actually educates most of the policymakers and the diplomats, that is the number one foreign investor or donor. Massive network. Now, what I was saying is that the moment that the Saudis made the pivot, you see the Qataris instantly activating this massive empire on behalf of the Saudis, for them against the Emiratis and the Israelis, amplifying narrative. So if you go to the Foreign Policy magazine, if you go to the assessment of the strategic experts from King's College London, you'll find the same one narrative, which is Saudi Arabia is the voice of Arab reason that's trying to maintain stability and sovereignty. That the Emiratis, who are acting basically as stooges for the Israelis, destroying and attempting to fragment Arab countries into enclaves that they can easily exploit. That's kind of the official narrative that now is running.
Oh, that's big. This is really big because, I mean, first, you mentioned that essentially Israel succeeded too much in weakening Iran.
Right.
You mentioned that correctly. You saw this correctly, that the Saudis don't have an interest to see a free Iran. They have an interest to see a weakened Iran, because then and what this essentially says is that the Emirati vision, if I understand the Emirati vision, of true regional integration, mutual prosperity, and this kind of new model that I had assumed was taking hold in the region, that all of a sudden, finally, after decades of these silly, ego-driven rivalries and wars, countries in the region were waking up and realizing that we needed an evolution of the region into mutual stability, mutual, economic, political, ideological stability, and that the Abraham Accords were going to be the anchor of this. Saudis are saying, you know what? Nah, we're good. We'd rather just jockey for power. Iran's weakened. Israel did us a favor, and now we have to keep Israel in check. These are massive, massive ideas, Hussein. And the Emiratis, the Emiratis are more ideological in their understanding that the region has transformed. And why aren't the Saudis seeing this as well?
You asked a great question. I do other work for people who know. I write a lot about culture, ideology, and philosophy, exactly because this touches on major misconceptions I think that people have about the Middle East, and that's why I have to go through big things in order to try show people that they are wrong. It's actually we are the ideological ones. So the problem in the Middle East has been that had a lot of ruthless people who believe in nothing, who use everything, whether religion, whether this and that, and they're jockeying for power and ego trips and so on for a very long time. Vision of peace and integration, that's an ideological vision. That's an idealistic vision primarily, not shared by a lot of people who just do not, they are much more selfish. So the question of, are the Emiratis more ideological? Funny enough, it's clearly that yes, the Emiratis are, which is, I think, that kind of the normal liberal way of seeing, they see the opposite. They think, no, it's wrong. The Emiratis are indeed, but they don't have a big ideology. I think that, I mean, they have very little but strong ideological commitments. For example, their commitment against Islamism, an ideological commitment. The Emiratis do not compromise on it. They really fund and support a lot of anti-Islamist campaigns globally. You see now the Saudis, it's not like that. It's very instrumental. You know, I don't want Islamism domestically because I have other programs and they threaten me. But you know what? There is no reason that I shouldn't use it against Israel or against Emiratis. I would say that this is true of a lot of you. See the instrumentalism with Erdogan very, very often. You see also with the Qataris. I'm very convinced that the Qatari royal family are actually in person very nice people who love the best kind of scotch and a lot of other delights that the second.
Yeah, they don't seem very conservative on the personal level.
It's very instrumental. So the Emiratis have indeed this. I said I don't want to exaggerate that they have a whole ideology. No, they do have key ideological commitments. Israelis have key ideological commitments, whether to Zionism, to freedom, to Jewish independence. But by the end of the day, they also have interests. And we also have to remember that the Emiratis have economic interests in the region, in their logistical corridor works that they are building, so on and so forth. I expect to see if the Saudi behavior continues and this alignment with Turkey and Qatar, which is also knows how long this is going to last. I mean, it's an alignment between really wolves at this point. If it does continue, I think that will push actually the Emiratis even closer to Israel. May perhaps see actually a consolidation, something the Emiratis actually didn't want to do. They're very risk averse in a lot of ways. Consolidation of some sort of a bloc. And then the smaller states, so the ones who actually don't have power to compete between these large middle powers, smaller states will have to choose basically either issue-based choice to who to stand with. So I'm talking about then Egypt and so on. Two main questions I think will remain. That the United States, in all of this, as I said, obviously the United States almost completely absent, present at the same time. So you have this paradoxical role that the United States play. We're running Gaza, apparently. Now we're having the whole board to run it. Sometimes where our hands are out in, Syria and a lot of places, we're just not responsible for this anymore. The second major question I think a lot of this hinges on is Iran. So you said the problem is that it's really weakened Iran too much. I think it's true. They weakened Iran too much, but not enough. That's the problem. That is, the regime didn't collapse. And in time, that's a bigger issue because the question is what will come after. But if, just theoretically speaking, we know we live in a world with no guarantees, the worst can happen always. But if you end up indeed with a regime change in Iran, either a massive reform from inside the regime or just a whole different regime altogether that is no longer interested in Islamist ideology and no longer interested in acts of resistance, is going to be friendly to the West, rehabilitate international order, and either going to not care about Israel at all or even have a positive relations with it. That can become a transformative reality because that will restructure again the regional order in favor of that non-adversarial vision, or at least towards some. States will always compete. States will always have differing interests. The issue is to actually make an integrative framework in which they can take these competitions into institutional resolution.
Can I jump onto the ideological aspect on the people's level? I spoke to you about this a little bit before we started actually our show. It's really interesting to me that there will be a direction to try to re-promote the access of the so-called resistance ideology, right? And kind of hop onto that wave that is already has crashed. I mean, except for Egypt and Jordan, and I said that earlier, on a popular level, the average person, and this is just from my own social media, following, of course, the work that I've done as a journalist, even getting people on the street opinions, it's not a popular idea. The whole ideology of this, political Islam and the so-called axis of resistance and the Palestinian issue has become increasingly less and less popular on the people's level. Now, like I said, again, an exception with Egypt and Jordan for other reasons, and we can talk about that. But it's really interesting that that would be like a kind of a gamble or a bet that is just like, it's done. And now with the imminent, I think, change in Iran, which is happening, right? It's happening. We don't know when it will actually turn completely, what will happen next. Absolutely. But why are we, like seeing anybody try to like bet on that right now? It's just kind of like, it feels like so past due. Another aspect would be Egypt in all of this, because there's always tensions between Egypt and Saudi Arabia. And I think we've seen this, right? Like even on a people's level on social media, there's always these kind of campaigns, right? Of kind of criticism of one another, attacks, all of that. So can we kind of go into Egypt and all of this, but both?
Well, we shouldn't exaggerate. I mean, that reality is, and if that Palestine is kind of the ring of power of Middle East populist ideologies and populist politics. That is, it always sells. You already have a lot of purchase from a lot of normal people. There was a big transformation, as you said, Hayvi. I think it remains in certain segments of the middle class, urban Arab middle class, Arab elites for certain. A lot of them have changed their views on this. And this is why you have the UAE, have a lot of elite legitimacy, but they don't have street legitimacy in other Arab countries, the Abraham Accords in way. But I think
something you mentioned in your article, right, that the UAE is dependent on elite legitimacy, while the Saudis, the bigger demographic.
It's great asymmetry. It's also a Jewish problem, by the way. I mean, now we have this in the United States as well with Israel and Zionism and the problem that American Jews are dealing with. That basically now you have this bifurcation, and you have elite legitimacy, but you have a problem on the street level, especially social media. Populist politics now penetrated by, I don't know, foreign ops on social media.
Hijacking social media, yeah.
The Qataris invested. The Qataris, they are not playing. You don't throw billions of dollars into nothing. They know what they are doing. So I think that the Saudis know that this is still a winning card. They don't have to adopt, and Muslim Brotherhood ideology, but in terms of the level of anti-Zionism, the Emiratis are betraying Islam in order to work with the Zionists. I think they think they can do that safely. Now, I think it's a bad decision. I'm not defending it. I want just to say that there is a rationale. They thought about this. Bad. I think it's still a bad decision, but they have reasons to think it would work. About Egypt, as I said, so a lot of these smaller countries, first of all, they are dependent on both the Saudis and the UAE. In terms of investment, I mean, Egypt economically, everybody knows it's not doing very well. Egypt lost its power. There's two issues that they have any leverage on, basically shipping in the Suez Canal and the Gaza border. So their border with Gaza and Israel. But other than that, they really can't have a lot of leverage. They don't have a lot of leverage in the region. They can't initiate events. They can try to support actors in Sudan or Libya, but they don't have the freedom of action because they basically don't have the liquidity and the resources. So what I imagine that the Egyptians would do, and others too, is jockeying. I think a lot of them are happy to see the Emiratis basically now being on the defensive, being bombed by the Saudis, forced to withdraw out of Yemen, and humiliated every day on the media, because I think there's a lot of resentment of Emirati power and success. So the Emirati is jumping all over everybody and doing the Abraham Accords. So I think they are happy to see this. Ultimately, huge investment, the Emiratis, huge investment, let's say in Egypt on the Red Coast or the Mediterranean coast and the Sinai. And I think that will also means the Egyptians will have to try to extract as much as possible from both sides without tipping off the boat.
Well, I want to come back to Saudi here for a second. And so is this going to be the defining moment, defining kind of structure? You mentioned how the liberal world order in general is collapsing. You mentioned Trump and kind of this, maybe we can describe it as a very utilitarian kind of power dynamic U.S. engagement with the world as opposed to liberal world order arrangement, and that the Gulf states were trying to find their way within those power dynamics, and now they're essentially adjusting to the new kind of Trump book, which is what assets do you bring to the table? How do you leverage them? And so is this essentially what the Saudis are doing, or is there something ideological behind them? You mentioned obviously that essentially none of really the Middle Eastern actors, except maybe the Emiratis, all just utilizing kind of, if we think of a switchboard with different power levers, you have Islamism, you have the Palestine issue, you have U.S. dynamics, you have G. So is this essentially what the Saudis are trying to do in lieu of maybe generally regional beneficent ideology? Is this what you're describing here?
So I think you have to benefit. I mean, nobody does anything benevolently for just I'm gonna do even the Emiratis, by the way. You have to be winning something.
It's Machiavellianism.
Yeah, and this is what successful politics ultimately is. That is, I find a structure in which everybody wins something, so everybody comes and agrees to it. That's kind of was the idea behind the Abrahamic Accords. Everybody's going to get something. Everybody's going to get investments. Everybody's going to get, that was the idea. Right. And basically that on that switchboard, the Saudis figured out or decided that they can win more playing different switches. That basically they have comparative advantages in other areas. They would win more by not normalizing than by normalizing. They would win more by head-to-head with the Emiratis than with trying to contain the rivalry and work with the Emiratis everywhere. And there are a lot of, as I said, there's a lot of reasons. So we talked about the oil prices. That connects with the fiscal situation. I think the Saudis are in a fiscal crunch. They had this massive projects, massive investments of, Vision 2030. I think a lot of it is...
Which isn't going anywhere, right?
It's not going anywhere. It's tanking, going well. And then they have massive commitments. They made a commitment, and don't forget, they made a commitment this last year of $1 trillion to President Trump. It's in the U.S. It's a massive commitment. It's a whole $1 trillion over
a year of their GDP.
The year of their GDP over their commitments in Syria. You have commitments elsewhere. So you have all of these fiscal commitments. Oil prices are depressed, and they could be depressed more now that Venezuela is transforming, and could be more if Iran is transformed. What are you going to do? You're going to end up being poor, not able to honor a lot of this. Who has liquidity? Emiratis have liquidity. Qataris have liquidity. So you end up this big state. Do you want to end up like Egypt, this huge, massive state that is overpowered by these tiny neighbors that now tell you what to do? Maybe they calculated this way, and they figured, no, the way to do it, we're going to align with the Qataris and the Turks. If we align with the Turks, I have a low-cost ability to project influence in Horn of Africa. The Turks have bases there, Libya. So now I can project influence at a much, much lower cost. They'll save a lot of money. The Qataris will invest. They have endless liquidity. Maybe they will help me out with some cash. I check the Emiratis and put them down. I also check the Israelis and put them down. And now, in this way, I end up gaining my status, winning even more. That's kind of, I'm trying to imagine.
How do you keep this, Hussein? How much of this is egos and saying, you know what, the Emiratis are supposed to be our little brothers, and now they're overshadowing us? How much of it is an actual calculation that this is the smart move to do?
Not either or. It's both. I think it's a combination of both. So I keep analyzing all of these rational factors in order to understand how regional politics advances. But yeah, I think then you're onto something very important. By the end of the day, we're talking about personalist states. None of these are democracies. And leadership style matters. Emiratis and the Saudis, for those who dealt with them, they have very different leadership styles. And I would say that the Saudis tend to emphasize ego issues more than the Emiratis. It's definitely central there. As a matter of fact, in conversation between both of them, I heard exactly the analogy just gave about the little brother. And not just that, Ali Shahabi, who's known to be close to MBS on the court, and you can follow his account on social media, when the whole thing broke out, he wrote, I think, which he used the language of little brother, right? The Emiratis are little brother. They have to be respectful. They have to honor. And I remember one Emirati interlocutor also used it. It said, like, if we're really the little brother, you don't try to steal food from the plate of your little brother. And that
has actually heard it the other way, is that BZ have always had this big brother mentoring role to MBS.
Yeah.
So it's
you read these stories?
What is?
dig into the tribal aspect? Because there's like, I know that in these countries also there's the tribal like mystery and alliances versus animosity in some cases. You know that between, for example, Saudi Arabia and Qatar is a history of animosity, actually.
Yeah.
But between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, there hasn't been that. But it seems that are some, I think, differences in the kind of how Islam is being practiced. Like, you know, the Hanbali is in Saudi Arabia, as the Shafi'i is in the UAE. So, you know, can we dig into that to see, like, could it be also a tribal issue? And what about Qatar and Saudi Arabia? Because it's kind of hard to believe that they're going to be really deep in close allies, giving this tribal history to what's.
These were factors, honestly, that mattered much more in the past than they do today. As a matter of fact, I would say that all of the ruling elites and all of the countries today, much more closer mentally and culturally than at any point of the past. That is, all of them grew up playing PlayStation. That's a massive formative experience. I mean, as much as it sounds like something small, it's not really that small. Think more Americanized to a large extent. Almost all of them speak English fluently. You can't say this about former generations of Gulf rulers. I think that none of them is probably genuinely ideologically anti-Semitic in any way, even the ones who are funding the anti-Israel stuff. I think they're quite indifferent. You can't say that on former rulers. I mean, Kissinger talked about all the anti-Semitic vitriol he would hear from King Khalid. I don't think that's the case of rulers today. So I think the tribal stuff did matter in the past. I think what matters, I mean, if we take it as a step level to say on the analysis, is the power competition that's always been there, in which it used to be primarily tribal, the Gulf area. That is, by the end of the day, you have to think like a state. Like a state, Arabia is a massive country. Massive. It's huge. And it shares the same culture with these small countries. They do have, as you said, they have a history of conflict, a history of tribalism. I mean, Saudi Arabia really annexed tribes by force. That's not how the UAE was established, for instance. So there is always a fear that you will be swallowed for these small states, the big state, or at least be controlled by the big state. So you want to assert yourself independently, so on. Especially that you already had a precedent in this. Everybody remembers in the 90s, we woke up one day to find Saddam Hussein with a massive state in tiny Kuwait. So this is always in the back, in the back of the minds of these smaller Gulf countries. They always look at Saudi Arabia and they see ultimately a big state that can swallow them. You add Iran to this competition, which is a part of the competition, removing the entire Islamic Republic element of it. That is, if we actually go, in order to understand this whole thing between the competition between Iran and the Arabs, we have to go back to before the Islamic Republic. I mean, the Islamic Republic, I think, obscured along times the way we understand the region. It's of the Shah. Arabs and Iran were not friends. The Shah was secular, more moderate. He was not an Islamist. He was a friend of the West. But that's actually why they were rivals. It's because he was a friend of the West. He was the biggest recipient of Western favor, Western weapons. He was the biggest ally of the United States. Presented himself to the United States as the protector and the policeman of the Gulf. So their main ally, main Israeli ally, Gulf. He occupied, some Arab lands that the Arabs couldn't do anything. Emirati, and the Arabs couldn't do anything. He controlled a massive influence on the oil prices that would play with the Arabs with. So its competition will always be there. That is, the competitive dynamic between these states and each other. Iran is an Islamic Republic or not, always be there. Now, part of what we're witnessing is really Israel becoming part of the region. I mean, this is becoming part of the region, maybe not in the way that Israelis imagine that they'll become part of the region, but it's a messed up region, let's say like that. We don't have really a structure like the EU that make everybody cooperate, and we are, like to talk about how they can't agree on anything. By the way, it's the same thing. Arabs are the same.
Well,
they can't agree.
We're very much Middle Eastern in
Yeah.
defense.
They can't agree on anything.
You talk about any country club that wants to accept we're part of it, right?
Yeah. So Israel being part of the region means that Israel becoming inside all of
It's our place.
right.
Not only is in the region, Israel is a superpower in the region.
And that's ultimately, I think, what the Israelis have to understand is, so the Saudi logic in all of these are applying, and also the Qadri logic, the Turkish logic, the logic of anywhere. Best way, they are competing with Israel. I don't know if Israelis know that they are competing with them, but they are obviously in their head competing with Israel. Competition runs based on the logic. Israel can be kept a pariah that is out of the formal structure of recognition from regional politics. I wonder if the Israelis should actually try to break out of that assumption and actually start competing also.
It's a really good point to say, and Israelis are not there. Israelis are locked into it's a threat or it's a friend, and that's the only way that they really know how to think regionally.
You need to get out of that, Dan. It's not a reality anymore. You have many people like me. It's not just me.
I agree with
and my case. Yeah, of course.
I agree with you. You do something excellent in the piece where you kind of take the four major kind of competing powers that are dominating the region, and everyone has their strengths and their weaknesses that they're leveraging, right? And for the Israelis, it's really the military, the tech, and the military and the intelligence and the ability to disrupt. Emiratis, it's the financial and logistic infrastructure. For the Qataris, it's the media and the narratives. And for the Turks, can you spend a moment talking about how the Turks are trying to now play this game? Because Hayvi mentioned earlier how Turkey is really kind of filling the gap that the collapse of the Iran axis opened. What is Turkey's leverages, and how is it trying to fill in this gap? And then I got another question right after that for you.
So you're right. And in this essay, I tried to explain that this competition also doesn't happen. Think about it as a chessboard of like 7 different layers. Because not everybody has the same capabilities as everybody else, so they can't go to head in what they have. So, for example, as you said, what is the Israeli portfolio of power? Which is a very narrow portfolio. It's actually the smallest one, and it's the most dense. Technology, military dominance, military superiority, escalation control. Israel controls the heat. That everybody knows this. Once the heat up, no matter what you do, the heat is going to be up. I mean, they bombed Doha. That's how big this is. They bombed Tehran. And everyone knows that they can't compete with Israel on this. So basically, you have Israel playing chess on that level, and will always win.
But I also want to add the innovation, technology.
Of course, which ties into that military dominance. Then you have other domains in which everybody has advantage that impose costs on Israel in another way, right? So we talked about the Qataris. They have the money, the liquidity, and the narrative control. So let's say after Israel bombed Doha, how did Doha impose costs on Israel? Internationally, right? They activated the network against Israel. They activated their White House influence against Israel. You had, the White House angry because, a lot of people in the White House obviously have investment portfolios with Doha. Basically, they were able to impose costs on another way. So that's exactly how it works. You compete with me in my area. Israel cannot compete with Qatar in that area, but they can impose costs somewhere else. And basically how the game is played in the region. Now, Turkey, a very specific portfolio. Now, the Turkish economy has been tanking, so they don't have that much of economic power anymore. You have, first of all, it's a massive country, NATO country. They have a huge military that basically Arabs can't compete with, and that basically is able to determine outcomes in Syria. As we have seen, they have a drone industry. They are able to project power in Africa in ways that other Arab countries not. Of course, they are able to play big middle power games with both Russia and the United States. So that gives them a very specific portfolio. It doesn't give them a lot of leverage in certain areas. They don't control narratives in the Middle East. They can't really compete with Israel terribly, but they can help project power and determine outcomes elsewhere. And they do play with ideology. Erdogan's rattling with Jerusalem and so on and so forth. That doesn't stop him from trying to cooperate with Israel when he absolutely must. Having said all of that, I think it's very important to remember that Turkey also is Mediterranean power, and I think that's what countries realized, that basically you can try to check him in his own backyard through relationships with Greece and Cyprus, and we've already been seeing this with Israel and the UAE and Bahrain.
Yeah, I have essentially two questions here, and maybe we'll have to do another episode with you. First one is you had a chat, and I've seen you publish over time. Why is it that Emiratis cannot seem to play the narrative warfare game like the Qataris do? Why they keep succeeding at it, or at least not anywhere near the level of the Qataris. Why are the Qataris so good at this? And then why are the Emiratis seemingly not able to match them or compete with them on this level?
Few reasons. I mean, I think we can't exhaust the issue. It's a major issue. It's not getting enough discussion. I'll tell you the factors that I myself thought about. First of all, it's always easier to invest in an existing logical superstructure than to try to push a new one. That is, it's always easier to invest in an idea that's present and already have people who believe in it than to actually try to bring a new idea people believe in it. And I think all of us here in the show know exactly what we're talking about. Whenever we try to pitch a new idea to someone, it's much more difficult than trying to support an idea that. So that countries already have an advantage there, which is they are investing as it already exists. They didn't invent hating Jews and hating Israel and this pop. They didn't invent it. It's just there, and they just invested.
They perfected it.
They perfected it. Now the Emiratis are bringing something new. The Abraham Accords. How about we actually, instead of fighting the Israelis, it's a new pitch. Naturally,
coexistence.
naturally, it's much more difficult. That's number one. Number two, it's another big issue that I've been writing about. You have a massive asymmetry, pretty levels of investment in primarily left-wing ideologies globally. This is a Middle Eastern problem. This is an Israeli problem. This is a European problem. This is an American problem. But what I'm trying to say in fancy language is that all of your institutions that recruits and trains smart people have been captured by leftist ideologies. This is literally the truth everywhere, even in Israel. That means the cognitive power, the intellectual power, heavily, the thumb on the scale is on the other side. When the Qataris want to push their narrative, they can find extremely calibers, very educated people, prestigious credentials, actually believe and think in that way, and have complex ideas or complex ways to express that view. And what you get on Al Jazeera, this is what you get in their investment in the universities, this is what you get, and so on and so forth. People, by the way, a lot of them would do this for free. Believe in that stuff, right? You have a lot of leftist intellectuals who are anti-Zionist and think the Zionism is certain imperialism, and the Palestinians are the poor brown, it's the
noble savages,
so on and so forth. So you actually have, and these people, you have philosophers and thinkers who actually believe and think in this way. The Qataris just think
It's astonishing how detached from reality this idea is, especially for people like our region,
which is what most thinking people usually are. People think, I think people overestimate intelligence. But anyways, so all of the Qataris need to do is really pay the flight. Need to convince a lot of these people, just pay them the flight to come to Georgetown, Doha for a conference, to give a lecture there. That's really what you need to pay. It doesn't really cost that much. Now, that means that there is an asymmetry on the other side, and that you see it in always all of the soft power attempts, or maybe all the attempts that the Emiratis, a lot of the attempts that the Emiratis did to kind of kind of stand this or try to have some narrative control themselves. Many times what I see is basically they end up with, and this was told me by people who actually worked on this, where I have said the problem is we end up always with political hacks. You end up hiring people, because just power is not there. So you have to make people into, opinionated intellectuals who are actually pushing your vision forward and trying to control the network. But they are not really that. They are operatives.
Yeah, so you see that they're not no credibility into the lines that they're trying to push, because it's a less clear ideological line.
Yeah, and so it has much less credibility for a lot of people. So all of these asymmetries, it's already established. A lot of people already believe in it. Cultural and religious and intellectual and academic institutions are already heavily invested in the other ideology. It's very hard. And everybody knows it's very hard to have serious, they are there, but everybody knows it's a minority. Let's be clear. Serious people invested heavily in trying to understand these issues and articulating and dissenting interview that is cohesive areas against all of this anti-Zionism. So that makes for a massive imbalance in this situation.
Question is kind of a wrap up to your article and to kind of the opening where we started. It's mean, look at your thesis, your kind of reorganization of these power dynamics. It's mean that the Abraham Accords honeymoon, this window, the Builders Destroyers framework that I posited, did it never exist? Come back? Or is this kind of the new regional order that now all the major players have to navigate? And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a very, very different reality to get used to.
It's the latter. It's not that it never existed. No, it existed, but within a certain moment, within certain conditions that made it possible. The people did actually play in these roles that you talked about, right? There were people, the Saudis were on the side like enough of this. The Emiratis were on the side of the enough of this. A lot of Arabs were on the side of enough of this destruction. And then the other side, you had no resistance. And it was very clear, this is also what Asians Americans are extremely attached to the memory of World War II. It's just a moment of unbelievable clarity on what was going on. You had forces of destruction and nihilism and genocide. And on the other side, you had forces, including the communists, by the way, who were just not interested in that, who just wanted, they had disagreements, but they did not have destruction. And once World War II ended, then you had Cold War, then you had the communists, the Allies basically split, and then the West and the communists became the main competitor. So kind of there's a similar thing. It was efficient. You had conditions that made it that way. You had Iran sponsoring this axis of resistance, maniacs like Yahya Sinwar who ready to down as many people in blood. You had Bashar al-Assad. You had it was awful. I mean, we all lived through it. Conditions basically are gone. So possibilities are not there anymore. Today, politics are politics. Humans are humans. There are ego. There's money. There's power. And once that structuring threat is gone, and also the structuring force of the United States is gone, why should you have this? Why shouldn't I have it? That's basically, so you're going to have a structure. I think you're going to have structured competition. The foreseeable future, I think the framework that I'm trying to basically provide, I think it's going to be how we see the region. You have another massive, almost everything. A change in Iran could be one of them. No one knows exactly. Or how this happened. So I think yes, it is the current condition, but that also in itself is not eternal. And ultimately, idealistic people like yourself, I mean, I'm extremely ruthless and anti-humanist in the way I think about politics in order to understand better. But by the end of the day, ultimate or idealistic vision is still there, and I think we all share it. I think it's possible. It's much more complex than we've imagined. I mean, I think we had just a nice about how it could be. I think it's going to take a much more work, a much more time, and ultimately it will be, I think, when and if it's fulfilled, it's going to look also in a different way than we thought. As I said, competition is not going to end between states. There will always be fights over resources. The best way for it is basically to have institutional regional structure in which basically these competition then can place, and you don't have to do things that the Qataris and the Saudis are doing now.
Just history, right? That's how history.
Awesome.
We are definitely witnessing a major turning point in the region on so many fronts. I wonder how the conversation will look like in literally a couple of months at this point.
Right. True.
We'll have you then, and we'll see.
Yes. Let's get you back in a couple of months and revisit it.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Hussein Abu Bakr Mansour. It's obviously, again, wonderful to have you, and looking forward to having you in the future again.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
Thank you all for listening and watching. With you, Hayvi Bouzo and Dan Feferman, your co-founders and co-editors of Middle East 24. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure to follow ME24 on X, Instagram. Stay tuned for more deep dives and sharp analysis right here on ME24's Middle East Breakdown, and see you next week.